dialing in is a very important part of the barista's job. It does require a little bit of practice to get the hang of it. What I want to do here is to basically give you the foundational theory and process so that you can practice further on your own. When we use the term dialing in, what we mean is adjusting the parameters in our brewing process in order to get the best possible strength and balance of flavors. Those are both sort of sensory qualities that are difficult to convey in a video, so it is really important to practice this yourself and try tasting some espresso so you get a better understanding of what I'm going to be showing you here. When I say adjusting the parameters in the brewing process, there are 3 parameters that are really easy to measure in the espresso making process that tell us a lot about the extraction, and those are dose, yield, and time. When I say dose, I mean the weight of the dry ground coffee. When I say yield, I mean the weight of our extracted shot. And when I say time, I mean the amount of time that it takes for that shot to extract. We're gonna start by paying attention to dose and yield first. These 2 parameters together make up what's called our brew ratio. In a typical espresso preparation process nowadays, a common brew ratio is around 1 to 2, meaning for every gram of ground coffee, we will have 2 grams in our extracted espresso shot. It is really important to pay attention to the brew ratio and try to hit designated targets, because the way the espresso extraction process works is as we pass water through the bed of dry grounds, water acts as a solvent to dissolve soluble flavor compounds. As we pass more water through the ground coffee, more will be dissolved, but also the strength of the shot will go down because the dissolved solids will be more diluted in the beverage. If you have a very low yield, something like a 1-to-1 ratio between your dose and your yield, you'll have a very strong shot. It will be very concentrated, but you will also have a relatively low extraction rate, meaning you haven't dissolved very much from your ground coffee, even though it's very concentrated in the shot. So you'll get a weird balance of flavors, and you'll get a very strong, really thick shot. On the other hand, if you have a very high yield shot, something like a 1-to-3 brew ratio, then you will technically have a much higher extraction rate, meaning you've dissolved a lot more of the ground coffee than you would with a lower yield shot, but it will also be more diluted, it'll be more watered down. In order to better understand this relationship, I would recommend just trying shots with different brew ratios, and you'll be able to taste what I mean. This will help illustrate the fact that brew ratio has a huge impact on the strength of the shot. So for our espresso preparation process, we have certain parameters that we want to try to hit as targets in order to maintain this brew ratio. The dose that we're going to use is largely dictated by the basket that you have in your portafilter, and this will likely range anywhere between 17 and 20 grams. With this as our range for dose and a 1-to-2 brew ratio, we can then say that our target for yield is going to be 35 to 40 grams. So that's 2 of our parameters, the dose and yield, and we know that the relationship between those 2 things, what's called the brew ratio, largely dictates the strength of the shot. Now this 3rd parameter, time, is largely going to dictate the balance of flavors in that shot. A typical extraction time target for the size of shot that we're extracting is 25 to 30 seconds. During the dial-in process, it is beneficial to get comfortable with paying attention to flow rate and making judgments about the extraction process based upon flow rate. When I say flow rate, I'm talking about the relationship between yield and time, meaning we're paying attention to the speed at which the water is flowing through the bed of grounds. That's what we call flow rate. Again, it's a bit difficult to convey sensory qualities of espresso through a video, but if you were to experiment with espresso shots with very different extraction times outside of this window, you would notice some general rules that will help guide you in making these adjustments, both by these parameters and also by taste. So if you were to try a shot with a really low extraction time, say 20 seconds, you would probably notice really bright, acidic, maybe sour, maybe salty flavors coming out. On the other hand, if you were to try a shot with a really long extraction time, say 35 seconds, you would probably notice really bitter, maybe astringent kind of mouth-drying flavors coming out. And those types of flavors are what we often describe as either under extraction for those really sour, salty flavors, or over extraction for those really bitter flavors. Generally speaking, the sort of hallmarks of a well-dialed-in espresso, or any other brewing method for that matter, would be a balance of flavors that's really pleasant, with a nice balanced acidity that's not sour, with sweetness really being prevalent in the balance of flavors. So generally speaking, during our dialing process, we are making adjustments in our preparation process in order to hit these target parameters. And then I would recommend tasting the espresso and making fine-tune adjustments from there based upon your knowledge and experience of tasting shots with different extraction times. During the extraction process and during dialing in particular, it's really important for the barista to pay attention to the flow rate, because that's essentially what the barista is adjusting. If you think about it this way, our dose and our yield are essentially fixed for us. Those are constant, especially if you're using a machine that has autovolumetrics. The machine will determine when to stop the shot, so your yield is a constant. Similarly, if you're operating a machine manually, you still have a fixed target for your yield, and you have a fixed target for your dose. So our brew ratio is essentially a constant that's fixed in place. The variable that we play with as baristas is basically our extraction time. So being able to judge flow rate, essentially whether we're getting to the finish line too quickly or too slowly, is what we as baristas need to pay attention to in order to make adjustments to the flow rate and in order to get the best balance of flavors in our shot. So the way that I tend to think about this is, if you pull a shot and the extraction time is really low, it means that the water is flowing through too fast. Our flow rate is too high. We need to slow it down. On the other hand, if it takes too long for the shot to extract, it means it's running too slow and we need to speed it up. The way the baristas adjust that is by making adjustments to the grind setting on the grinder. When we make adjustments to the grind setting on an espresso grinder, we are adjusting the position of burrs inside of the grinder. These are flat metal pieces with sharp ridges that basically crush the beans when the motor runs in the grinder. And the distance between these burrs dictates the size of the particles that comes out of the grinder. When we make adjustments on an espresso grinder, the sorts of adjustments that we're making are so small that the difference in particle size is going to be imperceptible, but it will make a noticeable difference in your flow rate and therefore your extraction time. Unfortunately, there is no precise rule that's going to be able to tell us how far we need to make an adjustment in the grind setting in order to achieve the desired change in flow rate. That's something that for each grinder you really have to gain some experience and experiment with in order to make that judgment accurately. So let's say I try a shot with a really short extraction time. The shot was 20 seconds. That's salty. Now let's try a shot with a really long extraction time. This shot was 51 seconds. That's really bitter. So in order to make adjustments to my extraction time by adjusting flow rate, by adjusting grind setting, I need to pull a shot and observe how long it takes to extract and make adjustments from there. I just pulled a shot a second ago that took 51 seconds to extract, which is very, very long. It's running very slow. In order to make it run faster, I need to make the grind setting coarser. Larger particles will allow water to flow through more quickly, therefore speeding up our flow rate, therefore bringing down our extraction time. On the Mythos grinder, the grind setting is adjusted using this grind adjustment knob on the right-hand side, and you can make the grind setting coarser by turning the knob counterclockwise, or finer by turning the knob clockwise. The shot that I am adjusting for was way too long, it was running way too slow, so I need to make the flow rate faster. To do that, I'm going to turn the knob counterclockwise in order to make the grind setting coarser. And in this case, I'm making a pretty significant adjustment. In most cases, you wouldn't need to adjust more than a single notch on this dial at a time. I'm going to adjust it by 2 notches because I'm looking for a pretty significant change in my extraction time. Anytime you adjust the grind setting on this or any other espresso grinder, I recommend running at least 1 cycle through the grinder, because you have some particles that are still in the grinding chamber that are at the old particle size that you just changed from. So to run a cycle, I'm just going to activate the grinder And now I can try pulling a shot with my new grind setting and then judging the flow rate, seeing if I need to make further adjustments. This shot took 39 seconds to extract, so the adjustment that I just made brought my extraction time down like I expected it to, but not far enough. I need to make another adjustment. Because my extraction time is still too long, I know that my flow rate is too slow. I need it to be a little bit faster. To make it faster, I'm going to make the grind adjustment a little bit coarser. This shot is right at 30 seconds, so it's right on the high side of my target range. At this point, I would taste the espresso, now that I'm within range, and make adjustments from there. It's not bad. Could be maybe a little bit brighter. In order to experiment with that, I'm going to make another adjustment to the grind setting to reduce my extraction time. I'm already sort of at the high end of my target range at 30 seconds, so maybe experimenting with a slightly shorter extraction time will bring out a little bit more of that brightness and acidity in the coffee and give me a better balance of flavors. So to experiment with that, I'm going to make an adjustment to the grind setting again and go a little bit coarser to bring down my extraction time. This shot ended up being 21 seconds. This tells me that I went too far. I was trying to bring down the extraction time, and I made an adjustment to make the grind setting coarser in order to achieve that, and it looks like I've made too much of an adjustment, so I need to go back in the other direction. A lot of the dial-in process is kind of this back and forth process where you're trying to hit a certain target, and you'll find that making adjustments will put you either too short or too far in your extraction time, and so you need to make adjustments to hit that target consistently. And this is something that you'll do first thing in the morning, but it's also something that you do throughout the day. You'll have to constantly make adjustments to the grind setting to make sure you're within your desired range to get the best balance of flavor in your espresso consistently throughout the day. I made another couple of adjustments to the grind setting. This shot was 29 seconds. Let's try this. This shot is pretty good. I really like the strength of this shot, and it has a pretty nice balance of flavors. With any espresso, you're going to get some bitterness just because coffee by its nature is a bitter beverage, but a well-dialed in shot should have a really pleasant balance of flavors where you get a little bit of bitterness, but it's really balanced with some nice brightness that's not sour, but sweetness should be the prevalent flavor, and that's what I'm getting out of this shot, so I'm really happy with it. And that is essentially the dial-in process. It's something you just do throughout the day to make sure your extraction stays within your set parameters. And I recommend noting your target parameters on a card that you keep on your grinder, just so that you know what your target is and you can always adjust back to that throughout the day. So that's essentially the dial-in process. I just want to add in a couple bits of advice to help make the process go a little bit more smoothly and easily for you. First, you may have noticed that I've been paying most of my attention to extraction time and how changing grind setting changes flow rate and therefore extraction time. And that is really important. That's most of what we're paying attention to during the dial-in process. In order to make informed, meaningful judgments about flow rate and extraction time, it is really important that we treat these other two variables, our dose and our yield, as constants. And this can be kind of tricky, especially during the dial-in process, because you'll probably notice that on most grinders, making adjustments to your grind setting will change how much coffee comes out of the grinder in your preset amount of time. So for that reason, it's really important that we weigh our dose for each shot that we're extracting to make sure that we're getting a consistent dose within 0.2 grams of our target for every shot. Generally speaking, when you make the grind setting finer, you will get less coffee in a given amount of time. If you make the grind setting coarser, you'll get more coffee in the same amount of time. And you have to make adjustments for each shot that you're extracting to make sure you hit your target consistently. Fortunately for us, a lot of grinders, like this Mythos 1, make that relatively easy. Let me show you quickly how to do that. So let's say my target dose is 17 grams. That's the recipe that I'm using right now. And I just ran my grinder and it gave me 16.5 grams in my basket. So I need a little bit more in the basket in order to get to at least 16.8 to be consistent. And one of the ways that I like to use the 3 presets on the Mythos grinder is one of them I'll set for a really short amount of time. In this case, I have 0.1 seconds. You could set it for 0.2 or 0.5 or whatever. And this allows me to run the grinder for just a really small amount of time in order to add bit by bit to the dose in my basket. So I can go back with my 16.5 grams and run the grinder. Weigh that again. 16.7, let's try that again. 16.9, so it's within 0.2 grams of my target. On the other side of things, let's say I am shooting for 17 grams and I just ran the grinder, and it actually gave me 17.5 grams, so it's over my target. I need to bring that down to at least 17.2 to be consistent. In order to do that, in this case, what I'll do is take a clean teaspoon and just carefully remove grounds from my portafilter basket, trying to not disturb the distribution too much until I'm down to 17 grams. These dose adjustment techniques are really handy during the dial-in process in particular, because during dialing in, you're making adjustments to the grind setting, which will change how much coffee comes out in a given amount of time. So what I would recommend doing is focusing on changing the grind setting so that it's dialed into your desired extraction time. And then once you have that set, you will make your adjustment to the main preset that you're using so that you're consistently hitting your target dose anytime you activate the grinder. Another bit of advice that I recommend as part of the dial-in process or really working with the machine anytime is if you're working on a machine that has more than one group head, I recommend getting in the habit of using all of the group heads pretty consistently and just kind of rotating through them. There are a few benefits to rotating through the group heads. One of them is it helps even out wear on the equipment. Another benefit is it helps you account for any variance in the espresso making process. You might notice slight, minute differences in flow rate from one group head to the next. And if you're pulling shots on all of the group heads, you can account for that during your dial-in process. The third reason that it's beneficial to get in the habit of rotating through your group heads is it makes for a much more efficient workflow because you can take advantage of times in the process when your hands are free. So let's say I'm extracting a shot on this group head and I'm paying attention to flow rate on my scale. My hands are free even though I'm paying attention to this shot. I can go over here and flush this group head and dry out my portafilter basket and tear out the scale, all while this shot is extracting. And this allows me to make an informed judgment about the flow rate for this shot and start making an adjustment and pulling my next shot without having to wait for the shot to finish. So that covers the essential theory and practice for dialing in espresso. Getting comfortable with this process does require some practice. I recommend practicing both by paying attention to your parameters and adjusting by taste. If you pay attention to those things, you'll build a solid foundation and then pick up speed as you practice it. I would expect an experienced barista to be able to dial in an espresso in about 10 minutes.